want to start with a question for you, an invitation to tell a story. How many of you on your wedding day had a mishap? Ken?
On our wedding day, there was an accident on the Malahat, and while I made it to the church in plenty of time, my wife was 2 hours late.
Okay, that's a good one.
Made me wonder.
Nice. Jesse?
Well, I was married in the Salvation Army, and the Salvation Army does not approve of the use of drink. But we had to have something to toast the bride. So I consulted with the commanding officer, my commanding officer, and he said, get some ginger ale and Welch's grape juice, and we'll mix them together, and it makes a lovely toast. So this was left up to me to do. So on the morning of the wedding, I went with one of my ushers. We went into Safeway, and we found the aisle with the juices and pop in it. I had it worked out how many big bottles of pop we want to need, and how much grape juice. So the grape juice is down on the bottom shelf as well, and I am passing them up to my usher there. And the last one that went past my face, I happened to see the French label, and it said "Juste de Breu."
Oh. Did you end up buying them?
Well, fortunately, I learned French in school, and some of it still stuck. And I realized that was not grape juice.
That would have been gross. Ginger ale and prune juice. Ooh.
So I didn't know Welch had made anything but.
Nice.
Fortunately, we found the grape juice and put the prune juice back.
Yeah.
That would have been something.
Yeah.
we had to know.
One of Jesus' lesser-known miracles, water to prune juice. Yeah, Marg.
I gotta tell one of my husbands, my now husband.
I figured you would.
On our wedding day, my fiance, the only job that he had to do for this wedding was to pick up the marriage license. He forgot. Oh, and the next day, of course, was Saturday. The day we were married was Saturday, so everything was closed. So we had to pull some strings. I had grown up there, so but we managed to get someone to come down to the courthouse to get the marriage license.
Oh. Very good. Yeah, Helen.
We had a little bit of a disaster. My mother made the fruit cake, and then it was shipped to me for candles, and then I was supposed to put the marzipan on and the icing, decorate it. It was already looking really bad because when I shook the dye in, it was supposed to be pale pink and bright red. It was already starting out on a bad note. Anyway, I thought, well, I can't change it now, I'll have to carry on. So then on our wedding morning, as we were taking everything down to Victoria, where our wedding was, at our friend's place, Mike was in charge of putting the cake in the back seat. And it slipped.
Slipped, huh, Mike?
Yeah, it slipped a couple of times more before we were So at the wedding, my husband turns to my mother and says, Mrs. Shaw, I am so glad that you made a good, solid fruit cake. The icing was rough, but the cake was good.
Bob?
My first wife was a really good one, but she had too many husbands. My second wife was the best that I ever had. And I go looking for a third wife, never even started coming.
So different types of mishaps. Yeah. So on my wedding day, Lauren and I we had pictures beforehand, which was a great idea. We didn't want that kind of awkward moment between like ceremony and reception, so we had pictures beforehand. It was going great, so then we had our families, and we all came to the place where we were getting married, Cana, where Lauren and I met. We were going to get married in the chapel, and it was going really well, and we had these amazing photographers, and they're taking these great photos of our families. But all afternoon, the humidity is building in the air, and in Ontario, it's so palpable, right? The air feels so heavy. So we get the last family photo done, and we look up, and the feeling in the air is electric. And we say, okay, time to go inside. So everyone rushes inside, and the skies just open up. And we got 6 centimeters of rain in 2 hours. It just poured down, which is fine. It's great. We're all indoors, with one exception, which is Lauren, who said, I think I left my cell phone outside. And so somebody went to check, and they said, well, where we were taking the photos is now flooded. And so we thought, well, I guess that's the end of it. Somebody went looking after. They found it, and it powered up just like nothing had happened. It was great. So it kind of wedding disaster averted, which is a little bit what our story is about today, a wedding disaster averted. So our story is from the book of John, early in the book of John. And it's this fantastic story that seems to grab our imaginations in a really unique way. So the story goes a little bit like this. It's said that on the third day, there was a wedding. So the wedding had already been going on for 3 days. And on the third day of the wedding, these are really long parties, Jesus and his mother are there with the disciples, and they run out of wine. And it's Mary who notices this. The mother of Jesus picks up on the fact that they have no wine. Now, if you're a reader in 1st or 2nd century, you hear this and you go, that is a big no-no. You never run out of wine before the party is done. But here we are, we're short of wine. And Mary goes up to Jesus and she says, they have no wine. And Jesus says, it's not my problem, right? He says, no wine, not my problem. My hour has not yet come. And Mary does this really interesting thing, right? It's like she ignores Jesus. And she says, she turns to the servants who are there and probably freaking out, and she says, listen to whatever he says. So Jesus, somewhere in all of this, has had a change of heart or something, and he says to the servants, go and fill up these ceremonial jars. So there's 6 of them there, the story says, and each of them hold between 20 and 30 gallons of liquid, right? So they go and they fill them to the brim, which is, before taps and before hoses, right? So they're going to a well somewhere. They're coming and they're filling these jars up to the brim, which probably takes them actually a fair amount of time. So they get filled to the brim, and Jesus says, okay, now take a cup and bring it to the master of the banquet. So a servant takes it to the master of the banquet, and he sips the wine. And it's clear that the wine passes all standard, because he invites the groom over and kind of secretly says to him, well, most people, they serve the best wine, which this is, first drinks, best wine. And then as the party goes downhill or uphill, depending on your definition, the wine goes downhill. But he says, you haven't done that. And the text is really specific. It says, the master of the servant, he didn't know where the wine came from, but the servant did. And then John steps out of the story and he says, this is the first sign that Jesus is said to have done. And after the wedding is over, Jesus and his disciples and his mother Mary go to Capernaum. So what a fascinating story. I want to treat it in 2 different ways today. The first way, I want to talk about it more like a literary treatise. And the second, I want to talk about it as a theological statement. So first, a treatise on scurvy, that's not what we're talking about, but a treatise. So John, in his gospel, and we don't think it was written by John the disciple, it was the Gospel of John, just not written by a John. So the author of this book has a very specific thing that he's trying to do in his book. he's trying to paint Jesus as the Messiah. Now, this is a really important point because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have different emphases than John. So Matthew will focus more on Jesus as king. Luke will focus more on Jesus as healer. John focuses more on Jesus as Messiah. And so when he writes this book, what he's doing is he's pulling out excerpts from the life of Jesus to essentially prove his point. So let me give you an example. If you were doing a funeral eulogy for somebody, you would pick out stories from that person's life that would describe that person in a specific way that you wanted to see them. So if I was doing a funeral eulogy for Ken, which I hope I never have to do, by the way. Yeah. Well, I might pull out Ken as father, and I might tell this really amazing story of Ken performing with his kids. And then I would pull out another story of Ken building like a pirate ship in his backyard for his kids. And then I would pull out another one of Ken the Joker and telling about all the funny, you like to I don't know how to say it, like when we were making those movies for your crowdfunding campaign, we had a lot of fun being really goofy and letting go, right? So I would paint Ken in a certain picture. But if Jamie or Helen was doing a eulogy for Ken, which I hope you never have to do, they would pick out different stories, different qualities of Ken that they might see. And so they might, same person, but they might paint him in a different way than I would. Does that make sense? So John is doing that with Jesus. He's painting Jesus in a certain light. And to do this, he brings in a couple of really interesting little literary things. This is a little bit like grade 9 Shakespeare, I know. So first, Mary, who is unnamed in this story, her name is never used, is only used in the book of John twice. And the first time is in this story. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. So he has this miracle, water to wine. The only other time we see Mary in this book is in John 19. Jesus is on a cross, and near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved, so John in this case, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And she said to John, "Here is your mother." And from that time on, the disciple took her into his home. So we see the mother of Jesus, Mary, only twice. Once at the beginning and once at the end. Isn't that interesting? Then there's this third day reference. Now, when you're reading a scripture, details matter. So it seems like a very peculiar detail to include. On the third day of the wedding feast. Why wasn't it the fourth day of the wedding feast, late on the first evening, sometime in the afternoon on the second day? But it's the third day of the wedding feast, which, looking forward, is quite a meaningful reference, is it not? Resurrection, what day? The third day. Okay? And finally, for our literary look through this story, the book of John has 7 signs in it. So in this first sign, after the story is done, John explicitly says what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. It's very intentional wording. John is trying to make a point, and he's saying, look, here's the first of 7 things that I'm going to do. So then he goes on and he does these other miracles, healing of an official's son and a paralytic, feeding of 5,000, walking on water, healing a man born blind, and raising Lazarus. So this is really interesting. There's 7 days in a week. And so you go through the 7 days. On the 7th day, you'd have a Sabbath. For the followers of Jesus, they would have picked up on this. They would have picked up on the 7 days of the week. But But something very interesting happens on the 8th day. Normally, on day 8, it's actually day 1. After you've had the Sabbath, you begin the cycle again. But something is very different in this case. Jesus raises from the dead as the 8th sign. Now, you could chalk it up to coincidence, but I think that John is the writer of John is being very intentional about these subtle cues that he includes in the text. So, now to see this text as a theological work. You know, our world, in many cases, is structured as a hierarchy, as an organizational chart. We have people that are said to be at the bottom of this chart. And then there are people who are a little bit higher up, who are over top of the people at the bottom, and then a little bit higher and a little bit higher. And eventually we say that there are people at the top and that there are people in the bottom. And this holds true for church institutions. It holds true for corporations. It holds true for hospitals. It holds true for politics. Even social hierarchies work on this same model. And yet, what I think Jesus does is he takes these organizational charts that we put ourselves in, and he flips them upside down. Jesus is a chart flipper. He takes the way the world is, flips it on its side. So here's why I think that's true in this story. Mary is given a prominent place. Now, if you're reading this text in 1st or 2nd century Middle East context, Mary holds a lot of power, right? She is the mother of what is said to be the Messiah, and she's the one calling the shots at the wedding feast. She's not the person in charge, but there she is giving orders to the person who is said to be the Son of God. Now, that is very interesting. So when the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Now, Jesus' response here, woman, is not meant as a derogatory term. In grammar and culture, this would have been considered appropriate. Why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. And Mary doesn't heed that. She says, do whatever he tells you. The fact that Mary has such a prominent place in this story is intriguing and remarkable, and is setting the tone for the rest of the ministry of Jesus. Example number 2 of 4. Wine is made in water jars used for cleansing. So again, this very peculiar detail. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. And Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. Now, in the Jewish culture, there is cleansing that you do on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. If you're preparing for a meal, you go through a cleansing ritual. If you go to a banquet, the first thing that they do when you get there is they wash your feet. For women, in certain times of the month, there were cleansing rituals. And for men, in certain times of the week, cleansing rituals. Before you go to synagogue, cleansing rituals. You were always washing. How interesting is it that from these jars comes wine for a party? From water that is used for cleansing to wine from a party is a subtle but important shift. Okay, third note, 3 of 4. The servants are the one to see the miracle. So like I said before, servant takes the wine to the master drinks it, and he has no idea what's going on. He's completely oblivious to the fact that in the back room, there's 900 new bottles of wine. That's a lot of wine on the 3rd day of the party. And there, he's completely oblivious, except for the servant who knows what has happened. How interesting is it that the people who first get to experience this miracle are the ones in the back room. It's kind of like the shepherds. And finally, good wine on the third day is unreasonable and beautiful. So the party could have been over at this point. And the people who were hosting the party would have had a certain amount of disgrace associated with them. They would have been the ones where it was a lesson for generations to come. Make sure you don't have a party like the Smiths, right? Like, make sure you got enough wine, unlike, remember that time in Cana where the Smiths did not bring enough wine, right? They would have had a certain amount of shame associated with that. And in a culture of honor and shame, this would have been really important. So for Jesus to come in and to provide this abundant wine on the third day, when everyone's probably had a little bit too much over the last 3 days, is totally unreasonable and yet exceptionally beautiful. It doesn't make sense. And so we should not be surprised that when God works in the world, it's chart-flipping stuff. It's people at the bottom and the margins who all of a sudden are empowered and gifted. Over the Christmas break, I read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. One of the most fascinating parts in the book, I thought, was her look at Aboriginal people in Canada. And Aboriginal people in Canada have been fighting for their rights for the land for centuries. And they're the ones who have the strongest legal claim to stop tar sands and to prevent additional natural gas fracking. And she said, isn't it interesting that the ones most capable of now protecting Canada's lands and resources are the Aboriginal people who have been exploited and pushed to the margins for 150 years. So it should not surprise us, as we follow the life and the work and the teachings of Jesus, that we find this man working at the bottom of the barrel, the lowest on the pyramid. And in there, may we find good news.